Hi again, and welcome to Making Vinyl at Masterdisk. I'm Scott Hall, Chief Engineer and owner of Masterdisk, and this is Garrett Robinson, our Mastering Engineer, disc cutting engineer. Today we're going to hit a topic that people ask me from time to time. It's kind of an interesting one. There's definitely several different ways of looking at the question. The question is, what's the difference between DMM and lacquer cutting? So, interestingly enough, our lathe here at Masterdisk was actually made as a DMM lathe back in the day. It's actually a VMS 84 that about 15 years ago, when there was absolutely no call for DMM, it was converted back to a lacquer cutting lathe. So for anyone out there that really knows their lathes, you'll notice the VMS 80 stuff on here, but you'll also notice a couple VMS 70s things bolted on. It was done expertly, the conversion was done expertly, and it makes for a really nice setup, but it's not exactly the same as the VMS 82, which was a lacquer cutting lathe. The end result is the same, but there are some slight differences. The scope and the head box, just a little bit different. Anyway, so that's from the mechanics standpoint. The difference really comes down to what we're cutting on. So when we're cutting masters on a lacquer cutting lathe, we're cutting into a piece of aluminum coated in lacquer. Like I've said before, it's kind of like a dried, semi-dried lacquer paint. It's somewhat soft, and it allows us to cut a groove that holds its shape. So it's firm but soft. DMM cutting, on the other hand, is cut into a same size disc, but it's plated in copper. It's a stainless steel disc with a very thin layer of copper applied. The geometry, the makeup of the components, the groove itself is very, very similar, but since you're cutting into a very hard surface, a lot more force is necessary. And we can't use heat to help improve the scraping noise. So there is some inherent noise floor issues when you're talking about DMM. But when it's all set up properly, diamond stylus, and all other things aligned properly, it can be quite quiet, but there are some caveats. The DMM cut generally can't be as deep or shouldn't be as deep as a lacquer cut. The thickness of the copper plate is actually is thinner, and so you run the risk of cutting through that into the stainless steel, wrecking your stylus the same way that we have a problem, but you can't go quite as deep. What that generally means is we have to control the stereo information, the things that are panned wide. So DMM tends to work really well for things that aren't super wide. There's also an issue with the depth of the cut with regard to bass. So in general, you can cut a nice sounding record, but in my opinion, can't cut quite as loud or as deep as you can on a lacquer cut. Now there's then the benefits. Benefits of a DMM is that it's a metal part, and being such, it's a lot easier to plate. And you literally can pull the first piece of metal off of the DMM as a stamper. And you could pull multiple stampers off a single master plate, master cut record. I don't know what the limits are there, but they can clearly work faster and work with fewer steps in the plating process. If you can pull a stamper right off of the master copper and then do it again to create multiple steps, you can do a few thousand copies without having to do a three-step process. And every step in the plating process adds noises, or potentially adds noises and other concerns.
There's a lot of different production advantages or drawbacks to the different mediums. We got the lacquer and the copper.
Right.
What, besides the considerations we have to make as engineers in cutting on those two different mediums and the advantages we get in production as far as making parts more expediently, what is the consumer going to notice besides, you know, the shallower groove, less stereo information sometimes? What are we losing?
It's branded as such. And so the consumer reaction, if the marketing has been successful, the consumer might feel that it's superior. There's also been adequate marketing towards the lacquer products, feeling a little bit more analog. Interestingly enough, depends where you fall on this opinion about lacquer versus DMM has a whole lot to do with where you invested your money.
Yeah,
we have a lacquer lathe.
Yeah.
Of course, that's going to be my choice. If we had a DMM lathe, I would probably be torn because from a creative standpoint, I can make a record that sounds more like, in my opinion, the way a vinyl consumer wants it to sound. It's a little warmer, it's got a little better bass presence. Stereo bass is really well maintained, doesn't have to be manipulated at all. So they're likely going to respond, and this is what I've heard from people, not putting words in their mouth, is that it sounds more analog. The DMM system was created in the early 80s, beginning to be implemented.
Kind of as a next evolution.
It came about for two reasons. People wanted longer album sides, and they were starting to compare records to digital, and they were really starting to notice how noisy records were. And it held the promise of a much quieter record as a result. The problem is the records tend, in comparison to things that happened in the 70s and comparison to things that we're doing now with digital, they tend to sound kind of thin. They kind of just sound, because in my opinion, that's kind of where our ears were at. We were used to listening to early digital, and we had gotten kind of to the point where we liked thin and bright. All you have to do is listen to Born in the USA and, realize just how bright had gotten. It turns out there was very, 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 very hard side to cut on a lacquer. When I first started at Masterdisk, that was one of the big projects that we were working on at the time. And it had so much high frequency energy that it was really pretty difficult to cut. But compared to the CD, those vinyl sounded warmer. To answer the question, it's really going to depend on how it's cut, what their perception is going to be. I only know of a couple projects, and I was involved in one of them, where the producer did both and provided both of exactly the same master tape to the consumer, both the Lacquer and DMM. They were both cut from exactly the same digital vinyl cutting master. I cut the lacquers here, and the digital master was sent to Czech Republic, where DMM parts were cut. And I'll leave it to the consumer. We'll put up a link to the project. It's pretty esoteric. It's not for your faint of heart sort of listening. It's a pretty hardcore, but a rather well-known production. What I was told initially is that my first test pressings were approved and went straight through production, and they made several attempts to get the DMM to sound like the lacquers, and couldn't. That wasn't necessarily the goal. They were trying to just get it to sound good, in a DMM standpoint. So one other thing is, since the grooves are shallower on a DMM, they can actually predictably fit more time on a DMM. Sort of a misnomer, because we can cut thin, we can cut shallow here as well. Sure. It's just the copper is more uniform. So we don't have quite the micro variations in the level or the flow of the lacquer surface. Those are kind of mitigated on the copper. So you can cut a shallower groove that will stay shallow and it won't thin out like it does on typical lacquers. So that's the one sort of advantage that's also a bit of a disadvantage, because with the shallow grooves, you really end up not having as much energy, as much excitement, in the groove. So that's DMM versus Lacquer. I hope you found it interesting. Leave us some comments, and come back to see the next episode as we go on a quest for knowledge, making vinyl at Masterdisk. Thank you. I'm Scott. This is Garrett.